Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're diving into, well, some pretty major waves being made in the global economy. President Trump just recently, in fact, announced a whole bunch of new tariffs on imports. And we've got some pretty fascinating insights on this from a recent interview over at Democracy Now! They talked to economist Richard Wolff, and he had a lot to say. So our aim here in this deep dive is to sort of cut through all the noise, all the headlines, and try to figure out what the real impact of these tariffs could be. We want to look at, what's the thought process behind them, how do they fit into the bigger economic picture, and what's it all going to mean for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is not just some small tweak, right? This is a potential major shift in how the U.S. interacts with the whole global economy. So
Yeah.
yeah, the sheer scale of these tariffs, it really does deserve a closer look.
For sure, for sure. So let's break it down a little bit. On April 2nd, 2025, a date that President Trump, I guess, rather dramatically declared Liberation Day, he went ahead and unveiled these trade barriers, these tariffs. We're talking a 10% tariff on just about every import from something like 185 countries. I mean, that's a pretty big net he's casting there.
It's huge, yeah.
And then on top of that, he's proposing even higher tariffs, specifically targeting some of our key trading partners, the EU, China, Japan. China in particular is looking at a total of 54% in tariffs. And his whole rationale for this, delivered from the Rose Garden, very, very presidential, was all about reviving American industries. Bringing that wealth back to the U.S., putting an end to what he called the looting of America by all these foreign nations. He really honed in on how this would benefit American steel workers, auto workers, farmers, skilled craft people, really playing to that heartland Americana image. It was quite the statement.
It was, yeah, very much hitting those patriotic notes. But, while that kind of rhetoric, focusing on bringing America back to its former glory, pointing fingers outward, it definitely resonates with a certain segment of the population. Economist Richard Wolff, when he first reacted to all of this, he offered a pretty different perspective.
Yeah, he did.
He acknowledged that, this is a big deal, this is a significant moment, but he also called out, Trump's presentation of the situation as completely fantastical, as, really driven by self-promotion more than anything else.
Yeah, he really kind of flipped the script, didn't he? That whole idea of the U.S. being the victim in all this global trade. He challenged that pretty directly.
Yeah.
And he argued that over the last few decades, actually, the United States, and specifically, those at the top of the economic pyramid, have benefited immensely from this global flow of wealth. And that's a pretty stark contrast to the narrative that, that Trump was putting forward.
Right. Yeah, it's a totally different way of framing it. And that actually leads us right into Wolff's main point, the core of his argument, which is this idea that the American economy, or what he even calls the American empire, is in decline, and he sees these tariffs not as a solution to this decline, but actually as a kind of, well, I think he even said a sad way of handling the situation. Instead of actually addressing the fundamental problems within the U.S. economy, the idea is to blame other countries, scapegoat them.
Right.
He even drew a comparison to the decline of the British Empire, saying that protectionism, these kinds of measures, they're a very common response to a weakening of global power, but ultimately they're not very effective.
Interesting. And this is where I think for a lot of us it gets a little, murky. The mechanics of tariffs, how do they actually work? Who ends up actually paying for them?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's crucial to understand this, I think, to really get a handle on the whole situation. So in essence, a tariff, you can think of it as a tax, specifically a tax on goods coming into the U.S. from other countries. It's levied at the border as those goods are entering the United States. And here's the cue. This tax is paid by the American company that's importing those goods. Now, those companies, they might try to pass that cost on to you, the consumer, in the form of higher prices, right? But initially, that payment goes from the American importer to the U.S. government. So when you hear people talking about other countries paying these tariffs, that's not really how it's designed to work. American businesses are the ones facing this new cost up front.
Right. So it's not like they're sending a bill to China.
Yeah.
Right. It's American companies footing the bill, at least initially. And this is where it gets kind of, paradoxical, because you have the Republican Party. Historically, they're all about lower taxes, lower taxes, lower taxes.
Yeah.
And now here they are implementing what Wolff calls the most massive tax imaginable. I mean, that's a pretty stark shift from their usual platform.
It is, yeah. It's pretty striking. And Wolff's take on this is that it shows just how deep the problems run within the American economy. They're having to resort to these really drastic measures. But his point is, is this massive tax on imports actually going to solve those deeply rooted issues? Especially when, in his view, the United States doesn't have that same kind of global economic dominance that it used to.
Right, right. Okay. Now, it wasn't all, doom and gloom. There were some voices of support, too. Like Shawn Fain, the UAW president, he actually came out in favor of these tariffs. He sees them as, well, he called it a necessary step to end the free trade disaster that's been hurting working class communities for decades. And he pointed to the fact that, so many manufacturing facilities, big three auto plants, they've closed down over the years. And he believes that these tariffs can actually help bring those jobs back to the U.S.
Yeah, and Fain's perspective is really important here because it highlights the very real economic pain that so many American workers have experienced. They've seen these manufacturing jobs move overseas, and he sees tariffs as part of a strategy to try and get those companies to reinvest in American production, bring back those well-paying jobs, the jobs with good benefits and security. But it's also worth noting that even though he supports tariffs in the interview, Fain also expressed concerns about other potential Trump policies, like the proposals to eliminate contracts for federal workers or to cut funding for agencies like the NIH. So it's not like he's completely on board with everything.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, Wolff had a pretty strong counter-argument to Fain's position, didn't he? He voiced his disappointment, and he really stressed this potential for these tariffs to drive up inflation.
So if the cost of all these imported goods increases because of the tax, then American consumers, everyday people like you and me, are going to end up paying more for a whole range of products. And this, of course, hits the working class the hardest. So the idea is to help these manufacturing jobs, but the immediate effect might be higher prices for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, Wolff brought up this big risk of retaliatory tariffs. If the U.S. slaps tariffs on goods from other countries, those countries are very likely to do the same thing in return, right? They'll put tariffs on American exports. And, think about industries like American agriculture. They rely heavily on exports. If other countries start putting tariffs on U.S. farm products, those businesses, the people who work in those industries, they're going to be seriously impacted.
Yeah.
And you could actually end up with a net loss of jobs in those export sectors. Wolff even compared this whole approach to a Hail Mary pass. Like in football, when you're desperate, at the end of the game, you throw this long, low probability pass. That's the level of risk he sees in this whole tariff strategy.
Wow, okay. I like that analogy, the Hail Mary. It really kind of captured that sense of desperation, that gamble, Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how all of this connects to some of the other economic challenges that are, already in play. Specifically, those Trump tax cuts from back in 2017. They're actually set to expire this year in 2025. What's the link there?
So those expiring tax cuts, they actually create a pretty big fiscal challenge. Those cuts, they mostly benefited corporations and wealthier individuals. And if they expire, those taxes go back up. And Wolff's suggestion is that President Trump really doesn't want that to happen, right? It could alienate his base, his donors. But if he keeps spending at current levels and he doesn't want those taxes to rise, then the alternative is to borrow trillions more dollars. And Wolff's concern here is that the rest of the world, they hold a lot of U.S. debt, and they might not be so willing or even able to keep lending at the same rate. It's like, imagine if you kept borrowing money without increasing your income or finding new lenders. At some point, those lenders are going to start getting a little hesitant, right? They might demand higher interest rates. And Wolff's suggesting something similar could happen on a global scale with U.S. debt.
Okay. So you're saying that these tariffs could be seen as, well, maybe a way to generate some extra revenue for the government, to try and offset those financial pressures without directly raising taxes on his supporters or having to borrow even more money. It's like trying to find a way to balance the budget, even if it's a really, really risky way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And Wolff really sees this as a key part of the whole puzzle. And he even extends this to the possibility of cuts in social programs. He brings up, Elon Musk's analogy about using a chainsaw on government spending. And he sees that as a pretty strong indication that alongside these tariffs, there could be this push to drastically cut spending on things like Social Security and Medicaid, all those social safety net programs that people rely on.
Yeah.
And Wolff's obviously very critical of that kind of approach. He sees it as basically trying to solve economic problems by hurting the working class.
Yeah, so it's not just about tariffs, right? It's this whole, potential strategy. And Wolff, he's not really buying it. He sees it as misguided, potentially even harmful. Okay, so what about the rest of the world? How are other countries likely to react to all of this?
Well, Wolf predicts some pretty significant and maybe even unintended consequences on a global level. Like he thinks that this, enmity coming from the U.S., as he calls it, could actually have the effect of bringing Europe closer together. They've always had their challenges with unity, especially under the umbrella of these American alliances. But this could actually push them to become more unified. And maybe even more surprisingly, he points to the increasing cooperation between China, Japan, and South Korea. They have a long and complex history, but now they're starting to coordinate their response to these tariffs.
Wow, so it could actually backfire.
Right.
Instead of isolating these countries, Trump might be pushing them closer together.
Exactly. And Wolf makes this really interesting historical comparison to the containment policy after World War II aimed at the Soviet Union. He's saying that now, ironically, it's the U.S. that might be getting contained. They're becoming more and more isolated, both politically and economically. And he points to things like voting patterns at the UN, where the U.S. often finds itself with very few allies on major resolutions. He sees these tariffs as potentially speeding up that isolation, making other countries see the U.S. as less reliable, less predictable as an economic partner.
Interesting. And it's not just the big players like the EU and China, right? Wolff also mentioned that there are big tariffs being imposed on economies like Taiwan and Vietnam. And it raises this question about the logic behind it all, especially in the case of Vietnam, given their complicated history with the U.S. It seems like a pretty broad stroke approach.
It does, yeah. And it kind of reinforces this idea of, declining global power trying to assert itself, potentially causing a lot of disruption as it tries to figure out its new place in the world.
Right. Right. Okay, and I wanted to bring up this other perspective that we heard from Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. He had this interesting theory that these tariffs might not actually be about reducing the trade deficit directly. Instead, they could be about creating this kind of shock to the system that would force foreign central banks to lower their own interest rates. And the idea there is that it would weaken their currencies compared to the U.S. dollar, and that would offset the higher prices of those imported goods for American consumers. So it would be like making the countries subject to the tariffs pay indirectly through these currency adjustments. What did Wolff think about that?
So Wolf, he actually acknowledged that he and Varoufakis, they have a good working relationship. But he made it very clear that he disagrees with that particular analysis. He emphasized that the effects of tariffs are really hard to predict. There are so many global factors at play: interest rates, exchange rates, the overall health of different economies around the world. It's impossible to know for sure what the final impact is going to be.
So basically, it's a huge gamble with no guaranteed outcome.
Right.
And it's a big departure from that whole free trade philosophy that's been guiding global economics for the last, 50 years?
Exactly. And Wolf argues that the U.S., because it's not really winning in that globalized free trade system the way it used to,
Right.
it's now turning to this strategy of economic nationalism.
Yeah.
And he sees that as a really fundamental shift and potentially a very dangerous one. It could lead to the formation of these competing economic blocs at a time when the U.S. is already losing its grip on things.
He even brought up the situation in Ukraine, pointing out that a lot of people miscalculated how much Russia could rely on China and India to help them deal with the cost of the war. It's like he's saying the old assumptions about how global power works, they're not so reliable anymore.
Right, yeah. And all of this leads to that big question that Wolf poses. Is this the beginning of the end for the American empire as we know it? And his answer is he believes the decline has already been happening for the past 10 to 12 years. He even gave this really striking statistic. The combined economic output, the GDP of the G7 nations, it now accounts for a smaller share of the global economy, around 28%, than the combined GDP of China and the BRICS nations, which is around 35%. So the balance of power is really shifting.
Wow, yeah. So this isn't just about tariffs. It's about this whole bigger shift in global power. And Wolff's saying the U.S. is not really facing up to that reality.
Yeah. He basically painted this picture of a nation that's struggling to adapt to this new world order. They're turning to protectionism, but it might actually make things worse instead of better.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all back to you, the listener, for a minute. What are the main takeaways from all of this?
Well, first of all, these tariffs are a big deal. We're talking a 10% blanket tariff on most imports, with even higher tariffs on some of our biggest trading partners. And there's a lot of debate about whether they'll actually work and what Trump's real motivations are. He says they're going to revitalize American industry, but Wolff sees it as a sign of decline, a way to deflect blame. And then there's the potential for inflation, meaning higher prices for you at the grocery store, and the risk that other countries will retaliate with their own tariffs, which could hurt American businesses that rely on exports. And we have to remember those expiring tax cuts and how these tariffs might be a way to try and make up for that lost revenue. And finally, there's this whole bigger context of a shifting global landscape, where the U.S. might be losing its dominance, becoming more isolated.
And thinking about all that, here's something to ponder. If for the last 50 years, the consensus has been all about free trade, and now we're seeing this big shift towards protectionism, what does that tell us about how the world has changed? Have the old rules stopped working? What new models might emerge in this new world order? The economic landscape is definitely changing, and it's more important than ever to understand what's driving those changes.
Absolutely, some really important questions to consider. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep thinking critically. We'll see you then.
Thanks for having me.